here we are at 1390 to try to entertain you for a short while. I am Banks Anderson, and with me
I am
is
Mauskopf.
Mauskopf. And we're going to begin with a little music, and we're going to follow that with some musical history. We have with us a professional historian who is Cy.
Are we ready to go?
That, of course, was Beethoven, Minuet in G. Beethoven was not a string player. Beethoven was a piano player. And Cy will tell us a little about that in a minute. But I am a string player. Of course, the piano is also a stringed instrument. But some folks ask, where did the first string instruments begin? And if you were in Athens, 500 or so BCE, and you asked that question, who invented the lyre? The answer would be Apollo. And the story is, the god Apollo was pursuing his cows that Hermes had stolen and stumbled over a large, by large I mean the shell was maybe 18 inches across, terrapin or tortoise or turtle. And Apollo was very interested in the arts and also in medicine. And he decided that that animal would make a marvelous instrument. So he took the tortoise shell and the tortoise guts for strings and put the strings across the concave part of the shell and made, according to legend, the first lyre, in Greek, lyra. And the word is one in use today because Cy and I hope to be a little lyrical during the next few minutes. Cy?
Okay, thank you. Piano is much less legendary, and in fact, was invented pretty clearly in the early 18th century. There were other instruments that were played, keyboard instruments, most notably the harpsichord and the clavichord in this period. The piano had its name, pianoforte, or forte piano, illustrates one of its advantages over the other keyboard instruments, namely the strings. It's a stringed instrument, but the strings were hammered rather than plucked, as they are in the harpsichord, and you could get different loudness or softness, intensity of sound, by the pressure you put on the keys. And you could also, once the pedals were introduced, get sustained notes on the piano, which you could on the clavichord, but not on the harpsichord. So those were its advantages. And in the course of the 18th century, particularly the last quarter of the 18th century, it supplanted the harpsichord as the preferred keyboard instruments. And indeed, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, as the minuet we just played illustrate, composed lots of music in this period. Last thing I'll mention is the Beethoven minuet is in a sense not typical of what we think of Beethoven's music as being like, and indeed it dates from his so-called first or early period, from the mid-1790s, when he had moved to Vienna and had studied for a while with Haydn. And the music reflects the classical style of Haydn in this work. Beethoven, by the early 19th century, his style changed rather dramatically to the much more turbulent, romantic, if you will, style we associate with him. Last thing I'll mention leads us into our next work, next piece, namely a waltz by Johannes Brahms. In the course of the early 19th century, the minuet, which was, you might say, the prime dance, social dance of the 18th century, was supplanted by the waltz. The waltz, like the minuet, is in 3/4 time, but it's often, although not this one we're playing, it's often a more, what should we say, dramatic work than the minuets of the 18th century. We'll be playing a number of different waltzes, all dating from the 19th century. And we begin with this waltz by Brahms trying to think, what is it, E major? Okay. A major. A major.
So we're going to fast forward 1,000 years or so from Greece and the lute from the lyre there to the lute. And the lute was a lyre with a resonant wooden bottom that was attached to the area behind the strings, and it was a stringed instrument with pegs but and some had frets, some did not. But the folks who made the lutes were called luthiers or luthiers in American. And the most famous of those was a luthier who gave up making lutes and switched to making the first real violins, and that was Andrea Amati in Cremona in the middle of the 16th century. And his pattern for this instrument has persisted now from the middle of the 16th century to now we're approaching the middle of the 21st century. So very few musical instruments have remained as true to their origin as the violin, but I will talk later about the differences between my instrument and the instruments that would come out of the Amati shop. I should say that Amati's grandson had an apprentice, Antonio Stradivari, who went on to make Stradivarius violins. And our next
while we're talking historically, our next piece by an obscure, to me, French composer by the name of Gabriel Marie is called, and I'll try my French, La Cinquantaine. And it's listed as being in the ancient style. Gabriel Marie was a late 19th, early 20th century French composer who wrote pieces like the one we're about to play. And one of the common things as one moves into the 19th century was a sense of historical reminiscence. So many composers, probably the most famous in the early 20th century is Opera Respighi's old dances and air suites. But many composers wrote music in earlier styles, and that's what this is. It's basically a kind of, I guess, Baroque style of the period, maybe, of Amati and Stradivarius.
So La Cinquantaine. the age of Stradivari was at the end of the 17th century, early 18th century, and he had several styles of violins, and his biggest competitor in Cremona was the Guarnerius Berliezer shop, the Guarnerius family. These were all family craft organizations, and the Stradivarius family, Guarnerius family, were luthiers in Cremona. Now, when the instruments came out of their shop, there were some major differences between those Stradivarius and Guarnerius instruments and the ones that folks call Stradivarius and Guarnerius and play today, because they have all, the modern ones, have been renecked and had new fingerboards. And here, I think here is a painting, actually of Tompier from Chancellor House, painted in about 1700, about the time that Stradivarius and Guarnerius were making their instruments. And I want you first to look at the fingerboard. If you look at my instrument, the fingerboard ends just above the F holes. And this is the fingerboard, and you play the violin without any frets by stopping the string, pressing it on the fingerboard. Now, if you wanted to play any modern composer's piece, including violin music, there would be a lot of notes on the E string up in this part of the fingerboard. But if you had a Stradivarius or Guarnerius right out of the shop, you couldn't do that. Look where the fingerboard stops. It is way up here. So these very high notes on the E string would have to be played by harmonics. And by the way, in the Gabriel and Marie, there were harmonics. The string was not stopped onto the fingerboard. It was stopped, the vibration was stopped with the finger lightly on the string. But if you wanted to play a stopped high E note in an instrument out of the Cremonese shops in 1700, you couldn't do it. We'll talk a little bit more later about the bow, but look at the bow from 1700, and the curvature of the bow is like the curvature of all bows the centuries before, is convex. That is, the bow goes out like this, as you can see, and that, in a century later, that got changed. We'll talk about that. So, next on the schedule is
Poldini's Waltzing Doll, another waltz. I might just mention Poldini's Waltzing Doll, another waltz. I might just mention, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but the piano also develops rapidly in the early 19th century from the forte piano of Mozart and Haydn's and early Beethoven's time into the grand piano we're familiar with later on. And in the course of anybody who's played Beethoven's sonatas, you can literally watch the keyboard expand as Beethoven takes advantage of the new potentialities of new pianos developing in his own lifetime. Now, this waltz by Poldini I knew nothing about. I wikied him. It turns out, despite the name, he's a Hungarian composer, pretty much contemporary with Gabriel Marie, and similarly to Gabriel Marie is almost only known today for some of his piano works, most notably this Waltzing Doll that we're about to play.
more strings than just one string. It's called the double stops, and that piece ended with that double stop. And modern composers use a lot of those, but when you listen to Nicholas Kitchen play Bach, he can sound like two separate violins playing together because of the double stops that he is able to technically perform far, far better than anything I can do. Well, we were going to talk about what happened to the bow. This is the bow that I am using for this concert. And if you look, you can see that the bow is concave on this side, whereas before the turn of the 18th century, all the way up to the early 1800s, the bow that was used was convex. Now, not so much now, but perhaps 20 years ago, there was a big early music movement, where they tried to play music in the style ancien, like the Gabriel Marie, only with the real ancient instruments, short fingerboards, flat neck. The neck on this instrument tilts backwards. If you put the instrument down, it rests on the back of the scroll. This is the scroll. And here, these instruments, when you put them down, would rest on the back plate, and the old instruments, the varnish here in the middle, was worn away. You can see, before they were reknit, this area of the violin, the varnish was damaged and was worn away. So now we come up to the change in the violin, and that occurred in France by a luthier whose name was Tourte, Tourte. And he, in working with some violinists, decided they could lower the center of gravity of the bow and make it something that you could operate a little more easily by putting in this concave curve. So,
okay. We're going to next move back to waltzes again. Two waltzes by Franz Lehár. The waltz in the 19th century became particularly associated, I think most of you know, with the city of Vienna. The Strauss family, particularly Johann Strauss Jr., developed the waltz into the very popular lyrical form we're familiar with. And perhaps second only to Johann Strauss Jr. was Franz Lehár, who, like Johann Strauss Jr., wrote operettas. And indeed, the first waltz we're going to play from is from his Lustige Witwe, or the Merry Widow Waltz. And the second waltz is the Gold and Silver Waltz. I think you'll be readily familiar with both of them. got a bit lost in turning the pages back, but I think Banks carried on very nicely. Now, the gold and silver waltz. Page turn. Okay. The last piece we're going to play, and then do you want to say something first? Or?
No.
Okay, the last piece we're going to play is an interesting one. It's called in the score here a lullaby by Mozart. In fact, and everything is on Wiki, if you wiki this lullaby, which is listed as being Kerschel Catalog Listing 350, in fact, it's by a Johann Anton Friedrich Fleischmann, who was a pretty much unknown contemporary of Mozart, and it's one of these works that so often happens, became attached to the great man and has come down. It's very, whoever wrote it, it's a very beautiful piece.
And that is a lovely tune, I think. I want to thank those of you who have lasted to the end of our little entertainment. I do want to say that if you had been here in person, like Megan, our camera person, it would have sounded a lot better than probably over a tinny TV speaker and over the microphone in the camera, which picks up our speakers in the auditorium, which also are supplied by these electronic mics, all of which introduce distortions which are not there if you go to a performance and hear it in person. And we hope that that will be possible in the not too distant future, that we will have medicines and vaccines that will mean that we do not have to perform to just an audience of one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.